Thanks very much. You really honor me by your invitation. I'm very grateful to RJ and to Jeff and all those who've hosted me this evening with the Agora Institute and the Templeton Honors College. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks very much. I'm going to be giving you a talk this evening, which is really a talk that I wish I had heard when I was an undergraduate. And the talk is essentially that Mark Knoll and his claim that there is a scandal of the evangelical mind are not quite right. That there certainly is more that could be done to develop evangelical intellectual life. Evangelical intellectuals could certainly do much more, but there is far more to be encouraged about in the world of evangelical thought, evangelical scholarship than I think Mark Knoll gives credit for. He tells me that he would write the book a little differently if he were to write it today, but not that much differently. So he and I disagree. But of course, it's interesting that Mark Knoll himself is an evangelical who has perhaps given us the most acute account of the challenges with the evangelical mind, which itself tells you something. I do want to say, especially to those of you who are evangelicals, this is a university that has many evangelical students, evangelical professors, and this message is really more for you than for anybody else in the room, and that is that your evangelical faith need not be a barrier to outstanding scholarship, to vibrant intellectual influence, to powerful creative engagement with American intellectual life. Far from it. Your evangelical faith can be a tremendous resource, a powerful resource for engaging the life of the mind. When I was an undergraduate and graduate student, I don't know about Mark Knoll, but I was surrounded by lots of very sharp evangelical minds and was nurtured by them. And they didn't have a lot of formal training or exposure to much of what was going on in their disciplines. I was in political science, like many of my friends. I shared a house with Andy Crouch here sitting towards the front, who worked in theology at Boston University. There were many outstanding evangelical young people at Harvard at the time studying astrophysics, philosophy. One of my good friends at Harvard was a young man named Aaron James, who was in the philosophy department at Harvard. He had a choice when he left Westmont College, an evangelical college in California. He had two kind of career options before him after graduating from Westmont. He could either decide to become a professional philosopher or become a professional surfer. So he decided to become a professional philosopher, which you might think makes him not a very smart evangelical. But he's actually teaching in California and is able to be a philosopher and a surfer, though not a professional one. So these were people that were all around me. They didn't necessarily make a big sort of program out of their being evangelicals and fine scholars, but they very naturally, dynamically, I think authentically combined their evangelicalism and their serious intellectualism. So this is really the substance of my talk. That if you are an evangelical in the academy and want to pursue an academic career, don't be afraid. You have a tremendous amount to offer. There are tremendous now models, resources, examples of outstanding evangelical scholarship all around, and they can encourage you, inspire you, and excite you, and give you ways of engaging various academic disciplines in America in a substantive, integrally Christian way. One example is appropriate to mention in this context, and that's Alan Guelzo. Alan Guelzo, as many of you know, was the founding dean of the Templeton Honors College. He is a very open, candid, committed evangelical Protestant who is also among America's finest historians of the Civil War. Alan Guelzo is among the very top scholars of the Civil War, who interestingly has done his work as a historian from an integrally Christian perspective. He has an outstanding book on Abraham Lincoln called Redeemer President, which essentially brings a theological perspective to Lincoln's statesmanship and is a far more subtle analysis of Lincoln's religion and his inner life and his inner struggles than is available in almost any other historical treatment of Abraham Lincoln. And I dare say that it is Alan Gelzo's own personal evangelical faith that has enabled him to bring such a subtle, powerful new analysis and interpretation of Abraham Lincoln. So you have had right here among the country's leading evangelical intellectuals doing outstanding work. So I'll talk for a little while about this phenomenon. I hope you'll forgive me if I speak from my laptop. I guess it's sort of like a teleprompter. Some people need teleprompters, and I'm one of them. If you're any politicians in the audience will appreciate the need for teleprompters. This is a political season, but it's not a political talk. I'm not going to say any more about teleprompters or the politicians that love them, I promise. And I will say now that the talk that I am going to give represents an effort, a very kind of modest and very, you'll I'm sure find haphazard attempt to summarize a little bit the efforts of a research project that has gone on for 5 years. It was sponsored by the Institute on Religion, Culture, and World Affairs at Boston University. It was inspired by the great sociologist Peter Berger, who is still around. Many of you perhaps have read his classic works on the sociology of religion, sociological theory, like Sacred Canopy. He's actually an active blogger. So if you're interested in following Peter Berger's still fecund thoughts about religion, you can follow him on his blog at The American Interest. And it's also been my privilege to work on this project with my co-investigator, Dr. James C. Wallace, an outstanding scholar of religion and politics, completing his PhD in international relations at BU. James Wallace is not to be confused with Jim Wallace of Sojourner's fame. Well, this effort of ours to study evangelical intellectuals, I should say, first of all, always prompts jokes when I tell people that I'm working on evangelical intellectuals. Evangelical intellectuals, huh? Isn't that an oxymoron, like honest politician or military intelligence? No, it's not a joke. It is, in fact, an important subject. And Mark Knoll's book certainly inspired a lot of controversy about to what extent is there an evangelical mind? Is there an evangelical intelligentsia? And not to leave you in any suspense, I'll say right up front that the biggest outcome of our research was the conclusion that the phenomenon of an emerging evangelical intelligentsia is a far larger and broader one than we ever realized. In fact, it's far bigger than our meager research project could handle. Just to give you one example of the sheer size of the phenomenon we're dealing with, we did a survey of evangelical intellectuals a couple of years ago, and we targeted evangelical intellectuals by contacting evangelical scholars we knew in about 8 or so academic disciplines and some other intellectual professions. And when we did this, our hope was that we would hopefully identify a few dozen evangelical scholars and get them to complete our survey. In our wildest dreams, we hoped that maybe our response rate would exceed 300 respondents. Well, in the end, we had nearly 1,000 respondents. Now, I should say not all of our respondents turned out to be evangelicals. Some were committed Christians who were not evangelicals, Catholics, Orthodox, different kinds of Protestants, but the vast majority of our respondents were evangelical Protestants. They either willingly and self-consciously embraced the evangelical label, or it was clear from the way they answered our survey that they embraced evangelical theological convictions. And in particular, they all had a very high view of the Bible and biblical authority. They had a high view of the centrality of Christ's sacrifice on the cross as the basis of salvation. Their faith had a strongly personal and conversionist dimension. They themselves felt that they had experienced some kind of personal conversion. It was not just a cerebral or creedal matter, but a deeply experiential matter. Their faith also had an outward and activist dimension. That is, they were concerned to make their faith more than a merely private affair, bottled up inside, but they were concerned to express their faith and bear witness to their faith in and through their intellectual work. So it was not that there were more evangelical intellectuals out there than we imagined. There were many, many, many more evangelical intellectuals out there than we imagined. And our strong impression, clearly, was that the hundreds of evangelical intellectuals who responded to our survey were just a fraction of the evangelical intellectuals actually out there. For example, we came to be aware of very large networks of Christian scholars. Large networks, far larger than I actually understood, inside a wide range of academic disciplines. The Conference on Faith and History, for example, the Society of Christian Philosophers, the Association of Christians in Economics, and many, many, many more. And it became clear that each one of these networks or associations had at least hundreds of members. Each one had hundreds of members. The Society of Christian Philosophers alone has more than 1,000 members. The Society of Christian Philosophers is the largest special interest group within the American Philosophical Association, the largest of any. Now, not all the members of all those associations are evangelicals, nor would it be right to think that the agenda or charter or mission of every one of these associations is strictly speaking evangelical. But in almost all these associations, evangelicals are a major presence. Not only that, evangelicals were often formative in inspiring, founding, and leading many of these Christian scholarly networks. Evangelical historians such as Richard Perard were instrumental in founding the Conference on Faith and History, for example, which took off in the late 1950s and 1960s. Evangelical philosophers such as Alvin Plantinga, whom I'll be talking about at length in a moment, and William Alston and Arthur Holmes were instrumental in founding the Society of Christian Philosophers, which got off the ground in the late 1970s. One gets the strong impression, too, that evangelicals constitute a very large share of the active members of these societies. Not all of them, but a very, very large proportion. It's impossible to know exactly how large, but one suspects that these networks would not amount to much, frankly, without the presence of evangelicals in their leadership as well as in their membership. So quantitatively, just quantitatively, we're dealing with an enormous phenomenon. But one can ask, what really is the qualitative impact of this phenomenon? Sure, there may be lots of evangelicals in a lot of academic disciplines, so what? What real impact are they having? Are they in the kinds of places, are they doing the kind of work that really positions them to have any substantive influence on American intellectual discourse? Are they really affecting the quality, the atmosphere, the substance of academic life and conversation? One can sharpen this question, I think, by framing it in comparative terms. Many of us in this room, I'm sure, are aware that in some other domains of society and culture, there has been something like a quantitative and qualitative resurgence of religion. And the specific domain I'm thinking about is the domain of politics, which as a practicing political scientist I know something about. And here in this domain, there is probably something of a consensus that a real shift has occurred. Peter Berger has even ventured to suggest that world politics and world affairs as a whole have undergone a very dramatic shift indeed. And the shift can be thought of in terms of a before and an after. In the before phase of world politics, there was an undeniable and powerful trend of political secularization. That is, secular ideologies, groups, movements, parties, and leaders were in the ascendancy and on the offensive in the sphere of politics all around the world. I've suggested in some of what I've written that this phase may be thought of as beginning in the late 18th century, accelerating in the 19th century, and peaking in the mid-20th century during the 50-year period between 1917 and 1967. That was the before. That was the period of dramatic political secularization. But then there was an after. In the after phase of political desecularization, something very interesting and surprising happened. During this phase, quite unexpectedly, given what many sociologists had predicted would be the irreversible trend towards secularization all around the world, political space in numerous parts of the world came to be filled with increasingly assertive and influential religious actors and religious ideas. Political space that had been off limits to religion opened up and became more open to religion. Sometimes this was because political space became more open and welcoming to religious influences, in part because secular ideas and actors simply experienced a deflation in their legitimacy and influence. Sometimes a very sudden one, as happened with the rather sudden decline and collapse of secular pan-Arab nationalism in the Middle East and North Africa in the late 1960s. In other cases, it's not that political space became more open and welcoming, but simply that religious actors became more assertive, aggressive, and effective in breaking down the barriers that had previously prevented them from penetrating political space. In any case, the point here is that in this phase of political desecularization, the downward trajectory of religion's influence in politics was stopped, and it even reversed. It is not just that somebody stopped the bleeding, that the hemorrhaging in religion's influence was arrested somehow or another, but that religion increasingly gathered political strength and seized the political initiative. So what was a downward trajectory in terms of the influence of religion was not really halted, but became an upward trajectory. Of course, in many contexts, religion was achieving a relative increase in influence from a very low base. Religion, for example, had completely collapsed and been repressed in China during the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, so perhaps it's not surprising that religion would experience a relative increase from that very low base, but it was an increase nonetheless all around the world. And I'm not suggesting that the claim that political space suddenly was completely taken over or dominated by religion. But the trend line changed direction. Politics, and this is my point, politics began moving in a different direction. It moved from moving in a secular direction, secularizing, to moving in a desecularizing direction. And the shift in direction had a real impact, as a wide variety of countries and cases demonstrate, from Iran to Egypt, India to Indonesia, Russia to Brazil, all of whose public spaces have become far more religious today than they were in the 1950s or 1960s. Again, the point is not that religion suddenly became the only game in town in the politics of these countries, but rather, if the before phase in these countries was that religion was gradually being pushed out of the game of politics or to the margins of politics, the after phase of desecularization was that religion was back in the political game. In many countries, religious actors and ideas have become powerful enough to decisively shape political outcomes, as we have recently seen in Egypt, in which an organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, which even experts on the Muslim Brotherhood thought was dead at the end of the 1960s, has seen one of its own become president of the country. The result, as I've written, is that the 21st century, if it belongs to anybody, is likely to be God's century as far as world politics is concerned. So for our purposes, with this story about what has happened in global politics in mind as a possible analogy, we can ask the following comparative questions. And specifically, I want to ask and answer three questions in the course of this lecture. First, is there any evidence that intellectual space in America, is undergoing a kind of desecularization comparable to the way in which political space throughout the world has been undergoing a kind of desecularization since the 1960s and 1970s? Can an analogy be made, perhaps, between the political desecularization of the world that we've witnessed and perhaps the intellectual desecularization the desecularization of American intellectual life? That's the first question. Second, to the extent that there is any such evidence of an intellectual desecularization, is there any evidence that evangelical intellectuals and scholars specifically have played any kind of important role in this process of intellectual desecularization, comparable to the way in which evangelical political actors and evangelical political ideas have played an undeniable role in political secularization around the world, most notably in the nations of the global south as well as in the U.S. Third, to the extent that evangelical intellectuals and scholars have played an identifiable and important desecularizing role in American intellectual life, how on earth could such a thing have happened, given the reputation that American evangelicals have, which is a partly deserved reputation for being anti-intellectual, as Mark Knoll documents in the scandal of the evangelical mind. If such a thing did happen, how on earth does one explain it? How does one explain the emergence of an influential evangelical intelligentsia in America in the late 20th and early 21st century? In particular, how does one explain not only that an American evangelical intelligentsia could come into being but that it could become consequential, that it could become an important intellectual and cultural force. I feel like adding that the questions as I posed them, these three questions, sort of remind me of Churchill's famous line about Russia. Russia, Churchill said, is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Here, the questions I posed about the emergence of an influential evangelical intelligentsia are sort of like that, because I'm really asking, did this very unlikely group play a very improbable role in a virtually impossible process? Did evangelicals, who are widely regarded in intellectual circles as the epitome of intellectual backwardness, help to engineer something in American intellectual life, a surge in religious influence against all the powerful trends of secularization that are almost universally considered irreversible and unstoppable? Let's ponder the improbability of this just for a moment. For about 100 years, from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, American intellectual life was running headlong from the tutelage of religious ideas and institutions. One could call this long phase the Andrew Dixon White phase of American intellectual life. My friend Andy went to Cornell, so he knows about Andrew Dixon White. Andrew Dixon White towered over American intellectual and academic life for decades, becoming famously the first president of Cornell, which he headed for some 20 years in the mid to late 19th century. You get something of the flavor of Andrew White's intellectual style just by looking at the titles of his books. Consider such books as Andrew White's 2-volume A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, or his other book with a very subtle title, 7 Great Statesmen in the Warfare of Humanity with Unreason. As you can tell, Andrew Dixon White loved the metaphor of warfare and combat, and the enemy that he was fighting constantly was, you guessed it, religion. Religion and its tradition of unreason and hostility to science and scientific progress. And inspired by his own personal experience of the German Research University, White sought to completely rebuild American higher education on the premise that religion was chiefly a barrier to intellectual progress, not remotely an aid to it. So that's what's happening in American intellectual life from about 1850 to 1950. While American higher education was running headlong from religion during the 100 years between 1850 and 1950, much of American evangelical Christianity was running headlong from the centers, institutions, and ideas of American higher education. One could call this long phase the D.L. Moody, William Jennings Bryan, and Billy Sunday phase of American evangelicalism. These great figures who towered over evangelical Protestantism in the closing years of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century were decidedly not intellectuals. Evangelicalism's preferred envoys to the wider culture and its preferred instruments of reform and revival in America were an evangelist, a politician, and a baseball player. Which is not to say that these men were not intelligent. They were often brilliant and eloquent and cogent. But the point is they marshaled their brilliance and their eloquence and their cogency to articulate a sometimes strident dismissal of intellectual life and culture, of intellectual artifacts, of intellectual activity, of intellectual institutions. My favorite line from Billy Sunday is this one: I know about as much about theology as a jackrabbit knows about ping pong, but I'm going to glory. So when we ask whether the powerful trends of intellectual secularization encouraged by Andrew Dixon White and a host of other forces have been slowed or reversed by anything like an intellectual desecularization, we in effect are asking whether the very unlikely has happened. Is it really likely that these powerful forces that Andrew Dixon White and other reformers of American education really have been reversed? And when we ask furthermore, not only whether something like an intellectual desecularization took place, but whether it was actually aided by evangelical Protestants of all people, the religious progeny of people like D.L. Moody or William Jennings Bryan and Billy Sunday, well, we're really asking whether the completely impossible has happened. And finally, when we ask if in fact the improbable and impossible actually happened, how did they happen? How could they be explained? Surely the explanation must lie in a concatenation of circumstances and factors so unlikely as to border on the miraculous, certainly unpredictable. Well, I suppose I've by now so loaded the rhetorical dice or stacked the rhetorical deck, whichever metaphor you prefer, that you're not now in much suspense about how I'm going to answer these questions. So I'm going to very quickly offer my rough answers to my first two questions and spend a bit more time on the third question. That is, how do you explain how evangelical intellectuals have in fact experienced a major resurgence of vitality and influence? And that's, I think, the really interesting story. So the first question, has something like an intellectual desecularization occurred in at least some quarters in American academia in recent decades? I think, cautiously, I would suggest that the answer is yes. You'll have to wait for the book that my colleague James Wallace and I are finishing up on this topic to get more of our thinking on it, but I think that in at least some quarters, the trajectory has shifted in something like the way it's shifted in politics, and we are now seeing a reversal of secularization and an expansion in the presence and strength of religious ideas, individuals, institutions, and problems in some parts of American intellectual life. Not all, certainly, but we are beginning to see in some domains and disciplines an intellectual desecularization comparable to the political desecularization on spectacular display all around the world. But don't take my word for it. I'll just quickly call in two witnesses. Both of them are distinguished philosophers. Both of them are philosophers who are not only not Christians, but are fiercely hostile to the metaphysical claims of Christianity. One is Quentin Smith, very distinguished philosopher who teaches at Western Michigan University. In a journal article published in the journal Philo a couple of years ago, he argued, on the basis of considerable evidence, now notice, this is not a Christian, this is someone who's hostile to Christianity. He argued in a long journal article that since the 1960s, philosophy departments in America have seen an upsurge in the presence of philosophy teachers and graduate students who embrace theism. Based on his own personal experience and voluminous data that he cites, he believes that this upsurge was so dramatic that it amounted to what he calls, this is his phrase, not mine, the desecularization of the American Academy, and specifically of American philosophy. In fact, he estimated that something like 1/4 to as many as 1/3 of new graduate students in philosophy in America today are theists of some sort or another. Now, if any department of American intellectual life was uncongenial to religious belief, it certainly is American philosophy. As late as the 1950s, it was in philosophy, of course, where, thanks to the influence of logical positivism, religion was dismissed not so much as false, but as meaningless nonsense. Religious claims were not even regarded as having the dignity of being false. Religious claims were simply considered too absurd and meaningless even to consider seriously. So if Quentin Smith is right, this highly secularized bastion in the highest citadels of the American Academy is in the process of being desecularized. That's his term, not mine. My second witness is a very distinguished philosopher now at New York University, Thomas Nagel. Nagel is famous for contributing to numerous subfields in philosophy, epistemology, ethics, political theory. In the 1997 book, The Last Word, Nagel had this to say, I'm quoting him, "I want atheism to be true, and I am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers." Nagel continued, "It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that." But notice what he says at the beginning. "I am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers." And in recent years, Nagel has commented with increasing favorability on the work of Christian philosophers and scientists on various topics, specifically concerning naturalism and issues of evolution. So the point here is that Nagel's very candid commitment to atheism was being unsettled by the very intelligent and well-informed religious believers he was encountering. It seems clear to me that he was encountering them in the very academic and philosophical circles in which he was traveling. But he could not possibly have encountered them in such circles unless there had been something like a desecularization of American academic and intellectual intellectual life. That is, a trend toward more intelligent and well-informed religious believers not only having a presence in American intellectual life, but gaining a hearing of philosophers like Thomas Nagel. More would need to be said, of course, to make a solid case that anything like the desecularization of American intellectual life is occurring. But if anything like what Nagel and Smith have described has taken place, then we are certainly very far from the intellectual world that Andrew Dixon White was trying to build in the heyday of secularization of the American Academy. In other words, the highly improbable may in fact be happening in our midst, namely ground zero of secularization in America. The American Academy may be experiencing an upsurge in religious influence. Second, is there any evidence that evangelicals specifically made a substantive contribution to this desecularization of at least parts of American academic and intellectual life? Well, you won't be surprised that my answer is yes. As I've already noted, evangelicals have played a formative and in some cases indispensable role in organizing networks of Christian scholars in a wide range of disciplines. And these in turn have played an important role in putting scholarship informed by Christian faith into circulation in these disciplines. This has happened in philosophy, history, economics, my own field of political science, and numerous other fields. It's unfortunately not possible in the limited time we have to speak in any detail about evangelicals have shaped all of these disciplines. It's not even possible to speak in detail about how evangelicals have shaped any one of these disciplines. So I have to use a single case to illustrate the importance of evangelical contributions to the desecularization of the American Academy. In that case, I will use is that of Alvin Plantinga, probably one of the world's most distinguished, if not the most distinguished living philosopher of religion. He's someone with whom I've had long conversations and formal interviews over the last couple of years to better understand him, the forces that have shaped him, and the things that motivate him. As I say, Plantinga is among the most distinguished philosophers of religion in the world, also among the most distinguished philosophers of knowledge in the world. He's written widely and influentially on epistemology. He's also written a major book on the nature of necessity. He has exercised enormous influence over a very, very long career. If there's been any focus to his work, it is that he spent a lifetime wrestling with the question of the epistemic status of belief in God. Is belief in God justified? And must one have arguments to be justified in believing in God? But in some ways, explaining the existence of Alvin Plantinga is almost as hard as explaining the existence of God. Look at Plantinga's biography. He was the grandson of uneducated farmers who immigrated from Friesland in the Netherlands. He grew up about as far away as you can imagine from the centers of intellectual and cultural life in America. He was raised in places like Jamestown, North Dakota, population today 15,000. Huron, South Dakota, population 12,000. I think that was one of the larger towns that Plantinga lived in when he was growing up. Yet he was impressive enough by the time he was 17 or 18 to win a full scholarship to Harvard College, and then later went on to do a PhD in philosophy at Yale. Even more impressive is that Alvin Plantinga went on to be invited to deliver some of the most prestigious lectures in philosophy in the world, the Gifford Lectures in Scotland. The Gifford Lectures reads like a who's who of modern intellectual giants, philosophers and scientists like William James, Albert Schweitzer, John Dewey, Arnold Toynbee, Niels Bohr, Carl Sagan, all have been invited to give the Gifford Lectures. That's the level of Gifford lecturers. Except all the people that I've mentioned have given the Gifford Lectures only once. Alvin Plantinga has been invited to give the Gifford Lectures 3 times, twice in the late 80s and then recently in 2005. All of which makes Plantinga's intellectual trajectory truly extraordinary, if that's all you knew, what I just told you about Alvin Plantinga. But there's another piece of his biography that makes him more than extraordinary. It makes him almost inconceivable. And that is that Alvin Plantinga is an open, avowed evangelical Protestant. And that's not a term I loosely apply to Plantinga. Plantinga gladly embraces the evangelical Protestant label I've discovered in my conversations with him. More importantly, Plantinga describes himself as having had just the kind of personal experiences and personal relationship with God, as I noted above, that's a distinguishing characteristic of evangelical Protestants. Furthermore, Plantinga has gone out of his way to publicly identify himself as a traditional Christian believer. Indeed, this is so much the case that his evangelical Protestant faith is a well-known feature of his biography. As, interestingly, Thomas Nagel, whom I just mentioned a moment ago, points out in an article in one of Plantinga's recent books in the New York Review of Books just 3 weeks ago, interestingly, the New York Review of Books featured a review of one of Plantinga's new books on science by Thomas Nagel. And here's what Thomas Nagel says about Plantinga. Plantinga's religion is the pages of the New York Review of Books. Plantinga's religion is the real thing, not just an intellectual deism that gives God nothing to do in the world. He himself is an evangelical Protestant, but he conducts his argument with respect to a version of Christianity that is at the rough intersection of the great Christian creeds, ranging from the Apostles' Creed to the Anglican 39 Articles, according to which God is a person who not only created and maintains the universe and its laws, but also intervenes specially in the world, with the miracles related in the Bible and in other ways. Nagel, as I've learned from my conversations and interviews with Alvin Plantinga, knows Plantinga very well. And so he knew what he was talking about when he described Plantinga as an evangelical believer. In fact, Plantinga was invited to be part of a 4-year discussion group that Thomas Nagel organized between 2005 and 2009, a very small discussion group. Nagel invited the people he thought were among the best philosophers in the world, philosopher of religion, philosopher of biology, a small group. They met 4 times a year over 4 years between 2005 and 2009 to talk about issues of philosophy, religion, and science, and Alvin Plantinga was one of the handful of people that Thomas Nagel invited to be part of that group. So much respect as Nagel had for Plantinga. The thing to emphasize here is that when Nagel was talking about those very intelligent and well-informed religious believers who had an unsettling effect on his atheism, he certainly had Alvin Plantinga in mind. And Quentin Smith, writing in the journal Philo a few years ago about the desecularization of the American Academy, which I've described, he dates the beginning of this process of the desecularization of the American Academy to 1967. Why? The reason he dates it to 1967 is because that was the year Alvin Plantinga published his book, God and Other Minds, with Cornell University Press, which appeared like a thunderclap on the horizon of Anglo-American philosophy of religion. The core argument of God and Other Minds is that there is no reason whatsoever to provide arguments for the existence of God, any more than there's a reason to provide arguments that you all have minds that exist. It's notorious in epistemology that there are no good proofs for the existence of other minds in human beings. But just because there are no good proofs and arguments for the existence of minds in other human beings, it's not a reason to stop believing that you have a mind. You might have stopped believing that I have a mind by now, but still, there are no good arguments for believing that any of us have mind. We can't see each other's minds. Plantinga, at great length and with great analytical sophistication, makes these analogies between arguments for belief in God and arguments for other minds, and it completely revolutionized the philosophy of religion in an analytic mode in Anglo-American philosophy. So all that is to say that if there has been something like a desecularization, of course this is just one example in one field, but if there's been anything like a desecularization of philosophy, it would be impossible to tell that story without the influence of Alvin Plantinga. Of course, Alvin Plantinga would be the first to say that he was not the only person, not the only evangelical who played an important role. Nicholas Wolterstorff, his close friend since the early 1950s, also played an extremely important role. But my very quick and dirty summary of this is simply to suggest that evangelical Protestants like Alvin Plantinga played an indispensable role in the desecularization of the American Academy and in philosophy in particular. Third, and this, as I said, is I think the most interesting question for which we probably have the least amount of time, which I apologize for. How do we explain this? How do we explain, in a sense, how the virtually impossible occurred and became the means of bringing the highly improbable into being? How do we explain how there was an evangelical resurgence how serious intellectuals emerged, as it were, from an evangelical Protestant milieu and helped not just to thrive as intellectuals, but have an important influence, a wider influence on fields like philosophy. I'm going to try to do this very quickly. First of all, I think that one fact about Alvin Plantinga and the other evangelical Protestants that I've interviewed and talked to who've had an enormous influence, one fact about them is that they have an enormous intellectual self-confidence. They're not afraid. This is very hard to describe, but they're enormously confident. Now, that may sound sort of disturbing. I mean, we've met lots of academics who are very self-confident. That doesn't inspire a lot of confidence necessarily. We don't necessarily admire the self-confident academics we meet. In fact, Alvin Plantinga told me a funny story about a Yale professor that he had when he was doing his PhD named Paul Weiss. Paul Weiss also had enormous self-confidence, Alvin Plantinga told me. Paul Weiss thought that the history of philosophy went from Plato to Aristotle to maybe Whitehead and then to Paul Weiss. And it was very difficult. It was very difficult for Alvin Plantinga to work with Paul Weiss. In other words, Paul Weiss had enormous self-confidence, and in fact, he insisted that Alvin Plantinga include a chapter in his dissertation on Paul Weiss, because every great dissertation had a chapter on Paul Weiss. But that's not the self-confidence I'm talking about. What's striking about talking to people like Alvin Plantinga is that the self-confidence that they exude and have demonstrated was not just a bravado or an arrogance, but it was combined with an intellectual humility that avoided, interestingly, an intellectual complacency, the kind that smugly says, well, we have all the answers, we have it all figured out, sort of the way Paul Weiss, he had it all figured out, and he was sort of the culmination of Western philosophy. No, it was a self-confidence combined with a sense that we have a lot of work to do, and we can't take for granted that we have things figured out, but we can be confident because we can have a complete understanding of God's truth, not an exclusive understanding, but we can be confident that we don't have to be afraid of discovering anything that is going to be ultimately a threat to our Christian faith. The self-confidence was not an arrogance, but a confidence born of a strong sense of God's personal presence and commitment. And it's hard to describe this. It was hard for Alvin Plantinga to describe this. But as he began to describe it to me, ultimately it was based on his sense that he really had a personal, direct relationship with God. It's best described as him having an evangelical, personal, regenerative faith. He told me that in his teenage years, the whole thing, Christian faith, sort of became alive for him. But then, when he went to Harvard, when he was a freshman, he for the first time, he ran into determined opposition to Christian faith with his classmates, his professors, and that shook him a bit. And I'm going to quote Plantinga now, as he related this to me. I kept thinking, these people are really smart. What makes me think that I'm right and they're wrong? I mean, why don't they believe like I do? But then, he says, I'm quoting, but then I had this experience one time, walking back from the dining hall on a bleak November evening when it was kind of rainy and miserable. And it's hard to describe this experience, really, but all of a sudden it seemed to me that the heavens lit up. I heard magnificent music and the like. And in some way, this just seemed to be telling me, or my reaction to this was to think, well, all these doubts and the like are just a lot of baloney. And after that, I didn't really have any doubts. And I haven't really substantially since then. Though I do, like all Christians, have my periods of sort of, down periods, indecision, really wondering exactly what's going on and stuff like that. In other words, what was a central experience for Alvin Plantinga was, in a sense, a kind of classic evangelical experience of encountering God personally and directly. And I think that actually has a very important substantive relationship to Alvin Plantinga's own philosophy, which is that you don't need arguments to justify belief in God. You don't have to have any arguments, like we don't have arguments for lots of things, because it's actually possible for people to have direct encounter, and there's no reason to think that it's unjustified. And interestingly, Alvin Plantinga's friend, William Alston, had a similar experience like this in the 1970s. William Alston was an enormously influential philosopher at Syracuse University, raised a Christian, but then completely abandoned Christianity for his early philosophical career from the 1950s to the 1970s. But then he had this shattering experience when he was sitting in Christ Church in Evensong and hearing the choir. And William Alston was a completely changed man. He became a kind of very active, committed, evangelical Christian believer. And William Alston's experience, his having experienced that in the 1970s, led him to write an entire book on the epistemology of religious experience, in which he essentially argued that these kinds of mystical direct encounters with the divine can be a valid basis on which to believe and commit oneself to God. So a key to understanding much of this resurgence of evangelical intellectualism isn't some fancy idea or new argument or new theory that they borrowed from Levinas or somebody like that, or Edmund Husserl, or wasn't some fancy, sophisticated idea, but in some ways this is maybe almost disappointing to discover that what really is so interesting and important about these evangelical intellectuals isn't some fancy argument or idea they had, but that they were just so evangelical, that they really had a profound, deeply experienced, lived faith based on a direct encounter with God, with Jesus Christ, with Him in all of His regenerative power. So that's one key, really. So why should they be embarrassed about their faith? Why should any of us be embarrassed about our faith if it has that level of power and authenticity in your life? No reason to be embarrassed about it. The other thing, and I'll close. The other thing that's really remarkable about these individuals is that they have a tremendous love of their field. They love what they do. They love their colleagues. They love the intellectual enterprise of which they are a part. Alvin Plantinga he describes this as something he learned from a great professor of philosophy he had at Calvin College named William Henry Jellema. William Henry Jellema was an enormous influence at Calvin College. Interestingly, George Marsden, whom I interviewed a few years ago, recalls him giving an astounding lecture at Bryn Mawr College just down the road. A masterful, sparkling, amazing, synthetic lecture on the whole history of Western thought. And that's what Harry Jellema was good at. He didn't write anything. But he so impressed Alvin Plantinga that Plantinga transferred from Harvard as soon as he heard William Henry Jellema lecture and switched to Calvin College, which would have been considered crazy by lots of people. But Plantinga said it was the best decision he'd ever made. Because Jellema impressed on Plantinga a kind of love for the Western philosophical tradition and a desire to get inside it, understand it. Jellema was also a teacher of Peter Kraft at Calvin. RJ and I were talking about Peter Kraft. Peter Kraft also says that Jellema was the greatest teacher of philosophy he has ever encountered. Plantinga still says the same thing, that he's never met a more impressive teacher of philosophy. Never wrote a word, never published anything, essentially, but was an astoundingly brilliant teacher who, as I say, impressed on all of the students this love of philosophy. And this is something that, in a sense, Plantinga also inherited from his father. I just tell you this little story that Plantinga told me about his father. Plantinga said that my grandfather had a farm. I don't know if he had a homestead or what it was. And in Iowa in those days, you needed at least 2 people to run a farm. And he was hoping that my father, this is Plantinga talking about his father, would be the second, would help with the farm. But it didn't turn out that way. You'd have to cultivate corn in those days in those great big long fields with 2 horses, and then I'm not sure if it was one row at a time or 2 rows at a time. But in any event, you'd have to rest the horses at the end of the rows. My father would do that. He'd rest the horses at the end of the rows on this big Iowa corn farm. But then he would have taken a book along and start reading. And he'd forget about the cultivating. And then an hour or two later, he'd still be doing it. He'd still be reading the book, which in those days, in that part of the world, was absolutely horrifying. I mean, there was hardly anything you could do that would have been worse than that. So Flanagan says, my grandfather figured that this is not going to work, and he wanted my father to go to a Christian high school. But there were no Christian high schools in Iowa at the time. So Flanagan's grandfather moved his entire family to Holland, Michigan, switched careers, became a carpenter, and all that was to enable Alvin Flanagan's father to go to a Christian high school, which he did, which then enabled him to go to Calvin College, where he fell in love with philosophy, thanks to William Henry Jellicoe. And because of that, Alvin Flanagan's father himself became a professor of philosophy and then wanted his son to study philosophy. And Alvin Flanagan's father taught Flanagan to read Plato in Greek when Flanagan was 12, or at least started to learn Greek at that time. Think of the love that those people had for learning, for philosophy. They were thoroughly evangelical in their faith and what they believed, how they believed it. They had regenerative, direct, personal encounters with God, talk about faith in very personal terms. That was in no way in conflict with their love of philosophy. Francis Cardinal George once said that we cannot evangelize what we do not love. If we have an interest in evangelizing the university, evangelizing our fields, bearing witness, we have to ask ourselves, how much do we love those things? How much do we love our field? Do we love our colleagues? Do we love the discipline of which we're a part? If we don't love them, we can't evangelize them. Thanks very much.